They thought it was over. They thought humanity had finally broken. Across the void, thousands of human ships were turning away. Engines burning hard, formations collapsing, signals scrambling into what looked like pure panic. The alien armada watched it unfold in silence at first, then with growing satisfaction. This was the moment their doctrine had predicted. Every empire eventually reached it. The moment when resistance gave way to survival instinct. The moment when a species chose to run, and humanity was running. The command had gone out just minutes earlier across every human fleet channel. Clear, undeniable, and devastating. Retreat. Not a tactical withdrawal. Not a repositioning. A full retreat order. Every ship, every squadron, fall back beyond the outer defense line. Abandon contested sectors. Preserve what remained. For the first time in the war, human voices over comms didn't sound defiant. They sounded strained. Command confirm, this is a full fallback. Negative engagement authorization. Repeat, all units disengage immediately. But we still have firing solutions. Disengage. That is a direct order. The line went silent after that. On the bridge of the carrier Resolute Dawn, Captain Alara Vance stood unmoving, her hands resting lightly on the command rail. Her eyes weren't on her crew. They weren't even on her ship's displays. They were fixed on the enemy. A wall of warships stretched across the stars ahead, perfectly aligned, perfectly disciplined, and utterly relentless. The Ketheri Dominion, a civilization that had never lost a war in its recorded history. Their formations were mathematical. Their responses predictable only in one terrifying way. They were always correct. They didn't chase recklessly. They didn't overextend. They advanced exactly as doctrine dictated. And right now, their doctrine said this: victory phase. Captain, her tactical officer said quietly, all squadrons are requesting clarification. They think comms may be compromised. Alara exhaled slowly. No, she said. Comms are clear. Then we're really doing this? A beat of silence passed. Then she gave the order. Signal all ships. Execute retreat vector. No deviations. Around her, the bridge seemed to tighten. No one argued. No one questioned further. But no one looked comfortable either. Because this wasn't how humans fought. For 3 years, humanity had done the impossible. Against a technologically superior enemy. They had held. Not perfectly. Not without loss. But they had resisted in ways the galaxy didn't understand. Breaking formation rules. Using unpredictable strikes. Refusing to follow any known pattern of warfare. It had earned them something rare. Respect. Fear. And now this. Jump lanes collapsing behind us. Navigation reported. If we fall back any further, we lose forward positioning entirely. That's the point, Ilara replied. The words felt heavy in the air. Behind them, engines flared brighter as entire human battle groups began turning away from the front. One by one, the defensive line dissolved. Ships that had held their ground through impossible odds now abandoned their positions without firing another shot. To the Ketheri, it looked like confirmation. Their formations adjusted instantly. Pursuit configuration. Not aggressive, not reckless, just inevitable. They're advancing, the tactical officer said. Speed increasing by 0.8%. Alara allowed herself the smallest smile. Of course they are. Across the fleet-wide channel, voices overlapped. Confusion, frustration, disbelief. We're just giving them the sector? They're going to overrun the colonies. Command, we need permission to hold the line. Then a new voice cut through. Calm, measured, unshaken. Hold your course. Every channel went silent. It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. Everyone recognized it. Admiral Jonaria, the architect of humanity's entire war strategy. They believe this is our breaking point, the Admiral continued. They believe we are choosing survival over resistance. A pause. Let them. Alara's gaze didn't move, but something in her posture shifted, just slightly. Around her, the crew listened like gravity itself had changed. We have spent 3 years learning how they think, Rhea said. Every engagement, every loss, every victory. And now they think they understand us. Another pause. This one longer. Heavy fleet units will maintain retreat vectors. Do not engage. Do not deviate. No matter what you see. The words settled like a weight across every ship. No matter what you see. That wasn't a reassurance. That was a warning. They will follow, Rhea said softly, because their doctrine demands it. On the resolute dawn, Ilara finally looked away from the enemy fleet and toward her crew. They're right, you know, she said. Her first officer frowned. About what? They do understand us. A flicker of confusion passed through the bridge. Ilara's eyes returned to the stars ahead. They just don't realize what they're looking at. Behind them, space itself seemed to shift as more human ships disappeared into retreat vectors, some jumping, others accelerating beyond sensor range. The battlefield that had once burned with defiance was emptying, and the Ketheri kept coming. Steady, precise, unstoppable. They're locking pursuit lanes, Tactical reported. They're committing deeper than expected. Good, Ilara said. Good, the officer echoed. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the main display, watching the enemy's perfect formation stretch just a little thinner as it advanced. Just enough. You ever wonder why we've survived this long? She asked quietly. No one answered. Because we don't fight wars the way they expect, she continued. We never have. Another silence. Then, softly. And today we're not running from a fight. Her first officer's eyes narrowed. Then what are we doing? Ilara's expression didn't change. We're moving it. A subtle alert chimed across the console. Too quiet for standard priority, too deliberate to ignore. The tactical officer glanced down, then froze. Captain, I'm picking up something strange. Ilara didn't look surprised. Of course you are. It's encrypted, the officer said slowly. Fleet-wide, but not from Central Command. Can you trace it? A beat. Then, no. It's already inside the system. The bridge fell completely silent. The signal pulsed once more across their displays. Unreadable to most, but clearly intentional. Ilara's gaze hardened. Don't open it yet, she said. The officer hesitated. Captain, if this is a breach. It's not a breach. She turned slightly, just enough for the tension in her voice to be felt. It's a message. Another pulse. Stronger this time. Deliberate. Waiting. Outside, the last of the human defense line vanished into the dark. The Ketheri advanced without hesitation. And somewhere, hidden beneath the chaos of a retreat that wasn't what it seemed, something had just begun. If you're enjoying this story from HFY Global Tales, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next, because this is only the beginning. The retreat should have felt like defeat. Instead, it felt wrong. Across the scattered human fleet, something didn't add up. Ships broke formation, yes, but not chaotically. Their escape vectors weren't random. Their spacing wasn't desperate. If anything, it was controlled. Too controlled for a collapse. And that was the first thing Commander Elias Rourke noticed. Aboard the destroyer Valiant Edge, his eyes tracked the tactical display with quiet intensity. Around him, officers whispered under their breath, tension thick enough to choke on. We've lost visual on 3 squadrons, navigation reported. They jumped without clearance. Correction, Rourke said calmly. They jumped exactly when they were supposed to. The bridge went still. His second officer turned. Sir, with respect, we weren't given any synchronized jump schedule. Rourke didn't answer immediately. He leaned forward, studying the faint trails left behind by retreating ships. Tiny distortions in space, barely visible. They're not broadcasting it, he said. Then how would they? They're predicting it. That didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. Because prediction on that scale required coordination far beyond standard fleet protocol. Sir, tactical interrupted. Enemy formations adjusting again. They're compressing their forward line. Rourke's gaze snapped to the display. The Ketheri Dominion fleet, massive, gleaming, and terrifyingly precise, was doing exactly what it always did. It adapted. But this time, something was different. They're tightening pursuit vectors. Tactical continued. They're anticipating flanking attempts. Rourke frowned. No, he said slowly. They're preventing them. The realization settled over the bridge like a shadow. The Ketheri weren't just chasing. They were controlling the battlefield. Even in retreat, humanity was being boxed in. Multiple human vessels cut off, navigation added. They're being isolated and eliminated. On screen, it was happening in real time. Small clusters of human ships, those that strayed even slightly from the retreat path, were being surgically targeted and erased. No wasted movement, no hesitation, just doctrine. They've done this before, the second officer whispered. Rourke nodded. Not just before, he said. They've perfected it. For the Ketheri, a retreat wasn't an escape. It was the final phase of victory. They would allow the enemy to run, but only along paths they controlled. Paths that led to fragmentation, exhaustion, and eventual collapse. And right now, humanity was following that exact script. Or, at least, it looked like they were. Sir, Com said, voice tight. Fleet-wide chatter is escalating. Some captains are requesting permission to break retreat pattern. Denied, Rourke said immediately. The officer blinked. Sir, that's exactly what the Ketheri want, he replied. Any deviation gives them an opening. But staying on this path keeps us alive longer, Rourke finished. Which means there's a reason we're being told to stay on it. Silence followed, because no one could argue with that. Not with Admiral Rhea in command. Still doubt crept in. Sir, Tactical said quietly, if this continues, we lose too much. Ships, territory, people. Rourke didn't look away from the display. Yes, he said. No reassurance. No false hope. Just truth. And somehow that made it worse. Outside the viewport, stars stretched into long lines as the Valiant Edge pushed deeper into retreat velocity. Around them, other ships flickered in and out of sensor range. Some accelerating, some vanishing entirely. But not randomly. Never randomly. Wait, navigation said suddenly. I'm seeing a pattern. Rourke's eyes narrowed. Show me. The display shifted, highlighting dozens of human ship trajectories. At first glance, it was chaos. But then, lines began to connect. Angles aligned. Distances repeated. It wasn't a scatter. It was a design. They're spacing themselves, navigation said, disbelief creeping into their voice. Equal intervals across multiple vectors. Like a net, the second officer murmured. Rourke didn't respond, because if that was true, then this wasn't just a retreat. It was positioning. Sir, Com said again, more urgently this time. That encrypted signal just reappeared. Every head turned. Same signature? Rourke asked. Yes, but stronger. It's syncing with our systems. Block it. We tried. It's not external anymore. A beat. It's inside our network. The tension snapped tighter. Rourke stepped toward the console. Put it on a closed channel, he ordered. No external relay. No system integration. The comms officer nodded quickly. The signal appeared on the secondary display, still encrypted, still unreadable, but undeniably intentional. It pulsed once, then again, like a heartbeat. Sir, the officer said, voice low. It's waiting for input. Rourke stared at it. Somewhere out there, humanity was falling back under relentless pressure. Ships were being picked off. Lines were collapsing. And yet, this signal didn't feel like panic. It felt timed. Open it, he said. The bridge froze. Sir, we don't know what. Exactly, Rourke replied. Which means we're supposed to find out. A long, tense second passed. Then, the officer complied. The encryption dissolved instantly. Not hacked, not forced, accepted. And what replaced it wasn't chaos. It was clarity, coordinates, precise, calculated, spanning across multiple systems. The entire bridge leaned in. What am I looking at? The second officer asked. Rourke's eyes moved rapidly, connecting points, angles, distances. And then, he saw it. They're not retreat paths, he said quietly. The room held its breath. They're convergence points. A chill ran through the bridge. Convergence for what? Someone whispered. Rourke didn't answer right away, because the answer was already forming in his mind. And it didn't make sense. It shouldn't have been possible. But if it was, his gaze lifted slowly back to the main display. Back to the Ketheri fleet, advancing with absolute confidence. They think we're breaking, he said. A pause. Then softer. They think this is the end. Another pulse from the signal. This time, new data appeared. Timing sequences. Synchronization windows. A countdown already in motion. Sir, Com said, voice barely above a whisper. This isn't just us. This is going to every ship. Rourke nodded. Yes, he said. And for the first time since the retreat began. He smiled. Because this isn't a retreat. The words settled, heavy and electric. It's a setup. Outside, the stars continued to stretch as humanity fell back. The Ketheri pursued without hesitation. Their formations flawless. Their confidence absolute. They had seen this before. They knew how it ended. What they didn't know was that this time, they were exactly where humanity wanted them to be. The signal didn't spread like a broadcast. It spread like a realization. One ship at a time. One system at a time. Quietly slipping into networks, bypassing firewalls, appearing on consoles, as if it had always been there, waiting to be noticed. And once it was seen, it couldn't be ignored. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Captain Alara Vance stood in silence as the decrypted data hovered before her. Layers of coordinates, timing windows, and movement vectors unfolding in perfect precision. It wasn't just strategy. It was choreography. Confirm origin, she said. Her comms officer shook their heads slowly. We can't. It's not coming from command. Then where is it coming from? A pause. Everywhere. Alara's eyes narrowed slightly, because that answer didn't feel wrong. Across the fleet, the same realization was taking hold. On battered frigates barely holding together, on carriers bleeding power, on isolated scouts running silent through deep space, the signal appeared, identical, synchronized, and impossibly clear. And with it came a single line of text. No signature. No authority tag. Just 5 words. Follow the pattern. Trust the timing. Commander Elias Rourke read it twice. Then a third time. Around him, the bridge of the Valiant Edge had gone completely still. Sir, his second officer said carefully, this could be a trap. Rourke didn't look away from the display. Yes, he said. That wasn't reassuring. That's all you're going to say? He finally turned, expression calm but sharp. If it is a trap, he said, it's the most coordinated one we've ever seen. The officer hesitated. And if it's not? Rourke's gaze shifted back to the coordinates. Then it's the only chance we have. Silence settled again, because everyone on that bridge understood something now. The retreat wasn't stopping. The losses weren't slowing. And if nothing changed, there wouldn't be a fleet left to save. Sir, Tactical said, voice tight, enemy pursuit is intensifying. They're adapting faster than expected. On screen, the Ketheri fleet moved with terrifying precision. Their formations shifted in real time, closing gaps, tightening control, cutting off escape vectors before humans could even attempt them. They're learning, the second officer muttered. Rourke shook his head slightly. No, he said. They already know this playbook. That was the problem. Every move humanity made, every retreat vector, every regrouping attempt, it all fit within the Ketheri doctrine of victory. Predict, contain, eliminate. And right now, humanity was following every step. Which means, Rourke said slowly, we need to stop playing by their rules. He stepped closer to the console, eyes scanning the signal again. The pattern was expanding. More coordinates, more timing sequences. And now, routes, paths that didn't lead away from the enemy. Paths that curved, bent, and eventually turned back. Sir, navigation said, barely breathing. These vectors, they intersect with enemy pursuit lanes. Rourke nodded. Yes, they do. That's suicide. No, he replied. His voice was steady. It's something else. The signal pulsed again, and this time it changed. Not in content, in scale. A full system map unfolded across the display. Dozens of human ships highlighted across vast distances, all moving along separate retreat vectors. And yet, all connected, like threads in a web. They're aligning us, the second officer said. Rourke didn't correct her, because she was right, but not in the way she thought. They're positioning us, he said quietly. For what? She asked. He didn't answer. Because the answer wasn't on the screen. It was out there, approaching. On the edge of human sensor range, the Ketheri fleet advanced. Relentless, perfect, unstoppable. They weren't rushing. They didn't need to. Every second, every adjustment, every calculated movement tightened their control over the battlefield. From their perspective, this was already over. The retreat had begun. The outcome was inevitable. They're committing deeper, Tactical reported. Forward elements extending beyond standard doctrine thresholds. Rourke's head tilted slightly. Say that again. They're extending past optimal containment range, the officer repeated. It's minimal, but it's there. Rourke's eyes sharpened. Why? No one answered. Because the Ketheri didn't make mistakes. They didn't overextend. They didn't break doctrine. Unless they think we're collapsing faster than expected, Rourke said. Understanding spread across the bridge like a shockwave. They're accelerating the final phase, the second officer added. Exactly. Which meant one thing. They're committing, Rourke said. And that was dangerous. For them. The signal pulsed again. The countdown ticked lower. And suddenly, everything began to make sense. Not completely, but enough. They're not just chasing us, Rourke said. They're stepping into it. The second officer's voice dropped to a whisper. Into what? Rourke looked at the web of trajectories one more time. At the convergence points. At the timing windows. At the impossible coordination spanning across systems. And then he gave the order. Adjust course. The bridge snapped to attention. Sir, navigation asked. Match the signal, Rourke said. Exactly. That will put us directly across an enemy pursuit lane. I know. That reduces our escape window to less than... I know. A pause. Then quieter. Do it anyway. The engines shifted. Not away from danger. Toward it. Around them, other ships began doing the same. One by one. Silently. Without confirmation. Without hesitation. The pattern was being followed. Across the stars, the retreat was changing. Subtly. Quietly. But irreversibly. On the Resolute Dawn, Ilara watched it happen in real time. They're accepting it, her first officer said. She nodded. Of course they are. Even without knowing who sent it. Ilara's gaze didn't waver. They don't need to know who, she said. They just need to know why. Outside, the last fragments of the human fleet continued to fall back. But now, their paths were no longer just escape routes. They were lines being drawn, carefully. Deliberately, closing in, and somewhere, hidden behind layers of silence and precision, a plan was taking shape. The Ketheri saw a retreat. Humanity was building something else. And when the countdown reached 0, the galaxy itself was going to feel it. The countdown didn't rush. It didn't need to. Every second that passed pulled the Ketheri deeper. Every adjustment they made, every flawless, calculated move, tightened the invisible structure forming around them. To their sensors, it was simple, a collapsing enemy, a species finally breaking under pressure. To humanity, it was alignment. On the bridge of the Resolute Dawn, Captain Ilara Vance watched the timer drop in steady silence. No alarms blared. No one raised their voice. The tension had changed. It wasn't panic anymore. It was anticipation. Time index approaching final window. Her tactical officer said. All convergence vectors are within acceptable deviation. How close? Ilara asked. Less than 0.03% across all units. A faint murmur passed through the bridge. That level of precision across a scattered, retreating fleet was impossible. And yet, enemy status? She asked. Fully committed, the officer replied. Forward elements extended. Rear formations compressing to maintain containment. Exactly as expected. Ilara allowed herself a slow breath. They still think we're running. Her first officer gave a quiet, almost disbelieving laugh. At this point, Captain, we look like we are. Ilara's eyes flicked toward the main display, toward the Ketheri fleet stretching across the stars, their formation flawless, their advance unstoppable. Yes, she said softly. We do. Across the void, the Dominion's command ships analyzed the battlefield with absolute certainty. Their predictive models ran continuously, calculating outcomes, adjusting vectors, ensuring total control. Every scenario led to the same conclusion. Human forces were collapsing. Their retreat paths were inefficient, fragmented, and increasingly desperate. Small deviations appeared across their formations. Tiny inconsistencies easily explained by stress, damage, or miscommunication. Nothing significant. Nothing threatening. Nothing worth questioning. They're accelerating elimination patterns. Tactical reported. Isolated units are being targeted faster now. Alara nodded once. They're tightening the net. Her first officer frowned. Then we're running out of time. No, Alara said. Her gaze sharpened slightly. They are. The countdown ticked lower. 18 seconds. On the Valiant edge, Commander Rourke stood with both hands resting on the console, his eyes locked on the convergence map. The pattern had fully revealed itself now, lines intersecting across vast distances, forming something no single ship could see on its own. But together, it was undeniable. Sir, navigation said, voice tight, we are seconds away from crossing directly into enemy forward sensor range. Rourke didn't move. Maintain course. That will expose us completely. Yes. A pause. Sir, we won't survive that. Rourke finally looked up. You're right, he said. No hesitation. No denial. Not by their rules. The officer swallowed hard, then nodded. Because that was the point. The engines burned brighter. The ship adjusted its vector, just a fraction, but enough. Enough to step exactly where the signal had told them to be. 12 seconds. Across dozens, hundreds, thousands of human ships, the same thing was happening. Tiny course corrections. Perfect timing. No communication. No confirmation. Just trust. 10 seconds. On the Resolute Dawn, Alara's hand hovered just above the command interface. Signal readiness, she said. All systems green. Tactical confirmed. Weapons cold, as ordered. Her first officer glanced at her. We're really doing this without firing a single shot first. Alara didn't look at him. If we fire early, she said, we lose. 7 seconds. The Ketheri fleet advanced. Closer. Deeper. Their formation stretching just enough to maintain control. Just enough to ensure no human escape. They were no longer reacting. They were executing. 5 seconds. Enemy predictive models updating. Tactical said. They're locking final containment projections. Alara smiled faintly. Good, she whispered. For seconds. Rourke exhaled slowly. Hold steady, he said. Around him, the crew didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't breathe. 3 seconds. Across the fleet, the signal pulsed one final time. Not instructions. Confirmation. 2 seconds. Alara's voice was barely audible. Now they see us. 1 second. For the first time since the retreat began, human ships stopped running. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough. Just long enough. For the pattern to lock. Midnight. The trap closed. It didn't look like an explosion. It didn't sound like a weapon. It looked like absence. Across the Ketheri fleet, sensor arrays flickered just for a fraction of a second. A gap. A distortion. Something their models hadn't predicted because it wasn't supposed to exist. Space itself shifted. On every human ship, systems activated in perfect synchronization. Not weapons. Not shields. Something else. Execute Phase 1, Alara said. The command didn't echo across open channels. It didn't need to. Every ship already knew. Across the battlefield, the retreat vectors inverted. Engines that had been burning away from the enemy turned. Not sharply, not recklessly, but precisely. The web snapped tight. Ketheri command vessels reacted instantly, adjusting formations, recalculating trajectories. But for the first time, they were too late. Unknown spatial interference detected. A Ketheri signal burst screamed across intercepted channels. Human units are. The transmission cut. Not destroyed. Interrupted. Because their systems were trying to process something they had never encountered. Human ships weren't breaking formation. They were redefining it. Targeting solutions failing. Tactical reported. Enemy lock systems are desynchronizing. Ilara's eyes remained fixed on the display. Of course they are. The Ketheri doctrine depended on prediction, on perfect modeling, on knowing exactly where an enemy would be before they got there. But now, every human ship was exactly where it shouldn't be, because the retreat hadn't scattered them. It had aligned them outside the boundaries of Ketheri prediction. Phase 1 complete, her officer said, voice almost disbelieving. Across the stars, the perfect formation of the Dominion faltered. Not broken, not yet, but for the first time, uncertain. On the Valiant edge, Rourke watched as enemy targeting grids flickered and collapsed across his display. "They've lost lock," his tactical officer whispered. Rourke nodded slowly. "Because we're not where they think we are anymore." Outside, human ships began accelerating, not away, but across, through, and between Ketheri lines that suddenly felt thinner. Vulnerable. 8 seconds. A new countdown appeared. Shorter, sharper, deadlier. Ilara didn't look away. "Prepare for Phase 2, she said. Her crew moved instantly now, fear replaced by something else. Understanding. Because the retreat was over, and the part that came next was the reason they had run in the first place. The second countdown didn't feel like anticipation. It felt like release. Across the battlefield, the illusion of retreat shattered completely. Human ships that had been fleeing moments ago were now moving with terrifying precision, cutting across enemy vectors, slipping between formations, accelerating into positions the Ketheri had already calculated as impossible. And that was the problem. Impossible things weren't in their doctrine. "Phase 2 window opening," Ilara said, her voice calm but carrying something sharper beneath it. "All units, mark your targets." On the Resolute Dawn, the main display shifted. For the first time since the battle began, human targeting systems came online, not scattered, not reactive, perfectly synchronized. And every lock landed at once, across thousands of ships. On the Valiant edge, Commander Rourke watched as red markers flooded his display. Ketheri vessels highlighted not by proximity or threat level, but by pattern. "Sir," his tactical officer said, stunned, "these targets, they're not priority ships." "I know," Rourke replied. "They're structural." That was the word. Not the biggest ships, not the most dangerous, the ones that held everything together. "Fire on my mark," Rourke said. His crew hesitated, because for 3 years they had fought this enemy the same way. Engage threats, break formations, survive the encounter. This was something else entirely. "Sir," navigation said quietly, "if we commit here, there's no disengaging." Rourke's eyes didn't leave the countdown. 5 seconds. "Good," he said. For seconds, across the fleet, the same realization spread. This wasn't a counterattack. It was a commitment. 3 seconds. On Ketheri command vessels, alarms began to rise, not from damage, not from loss, but from inconsistency. Human vectors no longer match predictive models. Targeting grids unstable. Formation cohesion dropping below optimal threshold. Their systems weren't failing. They were being invalidated. 2 seconds. Ilara's hand lowered slightly. Now, midnight. The galaxy lit up, not in chaos, in precision. Thousands of human weapons fired simultaneously, not in a barrage, not in a desperate strike, but in perfect alignment. Every shot calculated, every impact timed, and every target chosen. The first wave didn't destroy the Ketheri fleet. It unraveled it. On the Valiant edge, Rourke watched as their weapons struck a mid-sized Dominion cruiser, not heavily armored, not heavily armed, but positioned exactly where it needed to be to maintain 3 adjacent formations. The moment it went dark, everything around it shifted. Multiple enemy formations destabilizing. Tactical shouted. "They're losing spacing, collision risks increasing." "Maintain fire pattern," Rourke ordered. No deviation. Around them, other human ships did the same. They didn't chase kills. They didn't pursue fleeing targets. They followed the pattern, shot after shot, node after node, thread after thread. And slowly, The perfect web of the Ketheri began to tear itself apart. On the resolute dawn, Ilara watched the impossible happen. "They're breaking," her first officer whispered. "Not yet," Ilara said. But her voice carried something new. "They're close." Across the battlefield, Ketheri ships attempted to compensate, reforming lines, adjusting positions, recalculating outcomes. But every adjustment created a new weakness. And every weakness was already targeted. Human forces are not engaging priority threats. One intercepted Ketheri transmission echoed. They are targeting support vectors. This is inefficient. This is... The signal cut as another ship vanished from the grid. Because efficiency didn't matter anymore. Control did. And the Ketheri were losing it. "Sir," Rourke's second officer said, voice rising with disbelief, "they can't stabilize. Every time they adjust, we're already ahead of them." Rourke nodded once. "Because we're not reacting to them." He glanced at the convergence map. Still active, still evolving. "We're acting on what they're about to do." That was the difference. The Ketheri predicted behavior. Humanity had rewritten it. A shockwave rippled across the battlefield, not from an explosion, but from movement. Entire sections of the Dominion fleet began drifting out of alignment, their flawless spacing collapsing into something far more dangerous. Uncertainty. And uncertainty was something they had never trained for. Collision warnings across enemy formations. Tactical reported. "They're pulling ships back to compensate." "Which opens new gaps," Rourke said. "Exactly. Then hit them." The Valiant Edge fired again. And again. Each shot small in isolation, devastating in sequence. On the resolute dawn, Ilara stepped forward, eyes locked on the shifting battlefield. "Phase 2 holding," her officer said. "Enemy cohesion down by 18%. "Push it to 30, she replied. "How?" Ilara's expression didn't change. "By not stopping." Because this wasn't a strike. It was a cascade. And once it started, it couldn't be contained. Across the stars, human ships moved like pieces of a single machine, each one aware, each one aligned, each one striking exactly where they needed to. No hesitation, no confusion, no fear, only execution. "They're retreating," someone whispered. At first, it seemed impossible. The Ketheri didn't retreat. Not like this. Not without control. But there it was. Subtle, small. The first signs of withdrawal. "Not retreat," Ilara said quietly. Her eyes narrowed, repositioning. Because even now, they were trying to recover, trying to reassert doctrine, trying to turn chaos back into control. But they were too deep, too committed, too exposed. "Phase 3 approaching," Tactical said. The words sent a ripple through the bridge. Because everyone understood now. Phase 2 had broken the structure. Phase 3 would decide everything. On the Valiant Edge, Rourke stared at the next sequence appearing across his display. And for the first time, his expression shifted. Not doubt, not fear, something else. "Sir?" his second officer asked. Rourke exhaled slowly. "Now," he said, "we stop fighting their fleet." A pause. Then colder. "And start ending it." Outside, the battle was no longer a retreat. It wasn't even a counterattack anymore. It was something far more dangerous. Because humanity hadn't just turned around. They had taken control of the war itself. And they weren't giving it back. The Ketheri had never needed to doubt themselves. For centuries, their doctrine had been absolute, refined across countless wars, perfected through flawless execution, and reinforced by one simple truth. It had never failed. Every engagement followed the same progression. Every enemy, no matter how unpredictable at first, eventually broke into patterns. And once those patterns were understood, the outcome was already decided. Prediction, containment, elimination. It was not just strategy. It was certainty. But now, that certainty was collapsing. On board the Ketheri command vessel Terralis Prime, High Strategist Vale Core stood motionless before a cascade of shifting data. His four eyes tracked hundreds of projections simultaneously, each one recalculating, each one adjusting, each one wrong. "Rerun predictive models," he ordered, voice calm but edged with something unfamiliar. Already in progress, a subordinate replied. Deviation persists across all simulations. That is not possible. It is occurring. Vale's gaze hardened. Across the display, the human fleet no longer resembled a fragmented retreat. It had become something else entirely, fluid, adaptive, and worst of all, unpredictable. Explain, Vale said. A pause. Then, reluctantly, we cannot. Silence followed, because in Ketheri command doctrine, that answer did not exist. We are losing cohesion across 17 primary formations, another officer reported. Human strikes continue to target non-critical vessels, but the structural impact is escalating. Vale's eyes flicked to the data. They weren't targeting power. They were targeting connection. Why, he demanded. Why waste resources on lesser units? No one answered, because the question itself assumed a rule that no longer applied. On the battlefield, human ships continued their precise assault, never overcommitting, never chasing, never deviating from the pattern. Each strike seemed insignificant on its own, but together, they were dismantling the framework of the Ketheri fleet. Formation integrity dropping below 60%, the officer said. Vale clenched his jaw. Stabilize it. We are attempting to. But what? Every eye turned toward the display, and there it was. Every time a Ketheri formation adjusted, every time they tried to restore order, human ships were already moving into the new gaps before they even fully formed. They are anticipating our corrections, the officer said. No, Vale replied sharply. They cannot anticipate what has not yet occurred. Another pause. Then, they are. The words hung heavy, because that wasn't just a tactical problem. It was a doctrinal impossibility. On the Resolute Dawn, Ilara watched the same moment from the opposite side of the battlefield. They're trying to stabilize, her first officer said. They have to, Ilara replied. It's all they know. But it's not working. No, she said. And for the first time, there was no hesitation in her voice. It won't. Because the Ketheri doctrine had one critical flaw. It assumed the enemy would always react. But humanity wasn't reacting anymore. They were dictating. Phase 2 completion at 89%. Tactical reported. Enemy cohesion continues to degrade. Ilara nodded. Prepare Phase 3. Around her, the crew moved faster now. Confidence replacing the earlier tension. Purpose sharpening every action. Because they could see it. The shift. The moment where the unstoppable force began to hesitate. On the Valiant edge, Rourke leaned over the console, watching the enemy formations flicker and fracture across his display. They're still trying to follow doctrine, his second officer said. They don't have anything else, Rourke replied. Then why haven't they adapted? Rourke's eyes narrowed slightly. Because adapting means admitting the doctrine is wrong. A beat. And they've never had to do that before. Across the battlefield, Ketheri ships began pulling back, not in retreat, but in controlled repositioning. They attempted to re-establish their perfect spacing, to rebuild the mathematical precision that had defined their dominance. But every attempt created new vulnerabilities, and every vulnerability was already accounted for. Human units are entering previously restricted engagement zones, Tactical reported. They are operating outside expected survival parameters. Rourke allowed himself a faint smile. Of course we are. Because those parameters were based on Ketheri predictions. Predictions that no longer applied. On Terrali's Prime, Velcor stared at the growing chaos. His fleet still powerful, still vast, but no longer unified. Why are they not pursuing decisive targets? He demanded again. Why do they refuse to engage command vessels? They are ignoring us, the officer said. That was new. In every war the Ketheri had ever fought, command vessels were priority targets, the head of the snake, the center of control. But humanity wasn't striking the head. They were dismantling the body, piece by piece, system by system, until the head had nothing left to command. Vale's breathing slowed, not from calm, from realization. They are not fighting to win this engagement, he said quietly. The officers around him froze. Then what are they doing? One asked. Vale's gaze darkened. They are changing the outcome. The words felt heavier than any alarm. Because if that was true, then this wasn't a battle anymore. It was something far worse. On the resolute dawn, Ilara's console lit up with the next sequence. Phase 3. Her eyes scanned it once, then again, and for the first time, even she felt the weight of it. "Captain," her first officer asked. Ilara didn't look away. "They're about to realize it," she said. "Realize what?" Her voice dropped slightly. That this was never about a single battle. Across the stars, human ships began shifting again. Not breaking formation, not scattering. Expanding. The web that had closed around the Kethari fleet was stretching outward now, extending beyond the immediate battlefield. Beyond the system. Beyond the fight. Multiple convergence points activating. Tactical said, voice rising. "This isn't localized, this is spreading." On the Valiant Edge, Rourke saw it too. New coordinates. New targets. Entire systems lighting up across the network. "Sir," his second officer whispered, "this goes beyond this fleet." Rourke nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. And there was no hesitation left. Because it was always meant to. On Terralise Prime, Veilcore finally understood. Not completely, but enough. "Signal all units," he ordered, voice colder than before. "Break pursuit. Re-establish defensive perimeter. We will reset the engagement." For the first time, a Kethari command to disengage. But it came too late. "Command delay across multiple sectors," the officer replied. "Signal disruption. Human interference." Vale's eyes widened slightly. Because even their communications were no longer reliable. "They are not just inside our formations," he said. "They are inside our timing." And that was something the Kethari had never faced. Across the battlefield, the human fleet moved as one, no longer retreating, no longer merely counterattacking, but advancing. Not recklessly, not chaotically, with purpose, with design, with intent that stretched far beyond the stars in front of them. The doctrine hadn't just been broken, it had been outgrown. And now, the galaxy was about to see what replaced it. The battlefield was no longer a battlefield. It was a chain reaction. What had begun as a single impossible maneuver, one retreat turned inside out, was now spreading faster than any fleet could track. Signals moved ahead of ships. Coordinates appeared before threats were even detected. Entire sectors lit up with the same pattern that had shattered the Kethari advance. And for the first time in their history, the Dominion was losing control of more than a fight. They were losing control of the war. On the resolute dawn, Captain Ilara Vance stood at the center of a command deck that no longer felt defensive. Every display had shifted outward, maps expanding, data streams multiplying, new systems appearing by the second. Phase 3 propagation confirmed. Tactical reported. Secondary fleets have begun execution. "How many?" Ilara asked. 17, confirmed, no, 23. More coming online. Her first officer let out a quiet breath. "That's not reinforcement." Ilara nodded. "It's replication." Because the signal hadn't just coordinated a fleet. It had taught it across human-controlled space. And even beyond it, ships that had never been part of the original retreat were now receiving the same pattern, the same timing sequences, the same impossible alignment instructions. And they were following them, not because they were ordered to, because they understood. "They're adapting it to local conditions," the officer continued. "Different enemy formations, different system layouts, but the same structure." Ilara's eyes flickered with something close to pride. "That's the difference," she said softly. "We don't need them to follow the plan. A beat. We need them to understand it." Across the stars, new battles ignited. Not chaotic, not desperate, surgical. A human frigate group in the outer Persis line feigned retreat from a Kethari patrol, only to pivot in perfect timing, collapsing the patrol's formation in under 30 seconds. A convoy escort near the Orion trade corridor scattered under pressure, then reappeared along pre-calculated vectors, cutting off pursuit ships from their support units. A lone destroyer in deep space transmitted the pattern to 3 isolated colonies, turning civilian defense fleets into coordinated strike groups within minutes. The war wasn't being fought in one place anymore. It was everywhere. On the Valiant Edge, Commander Rourke stared at the incoming data, his display no longer limited to their immediate engagement. New systems flickered into view, each one showing the same thing: human ships executing. "Sir," his second officer said, almost laughing in disbelief, "they're doing it without us." Rourke nodded slowly. They were always going to. Even the outer colonies? Especially the outer colonies. Because those were the ones who had learned to survive without doctrine, without structure, without certainty. They don't need perfect information, Rourke said. They just need the pattern. Another update flashed across the screen. Enemy formations collapsing in a neighboring sector. Human losses minimal. Ketheri losses accelerating. "They can't contain this," the officer said. "No," Rourke replied. "They can't. Because containment required control. And control required prediction. And prediction was gone." On board Terralise Prime, High Strategist Vale Corps watched the impossible unfold across a dozen systems at once. "What am I seeing?" he demanded. "Multiple engagements," an officer replied. "Human forces are replicating the same maneuver across independent sectors." "That is not possible," Vale said again. "They are not centralized. They are not synchronized by command. There is no single point of control." The officer hesitated. "Correct." Vale's gaze sharpened. "Then how?" "They are learning from it." The words felt wrong even as they were spoken, because learning implied time, and this was instantaneous. "They are not waiting for orders," another officer added. "They are interpreting the pattern and executing it independently." Vale's hands tightened behind his back. "That is chaos," he said, but his voice lacked conviction, because it didn't look like chaos. It looked like evolution. On the Resolute Dawn, Ilara turned slightly as a new report came in. Long-range scans confirmed Ketheri withdrawal attempts in 3 sectors. Her first officer blinked. Withdrawal? Across multiple fronts. Yes, the word hung in the air. Unthinkable. Until now. "They're trying to regroup," the officer said. "They're trying to survive," Ilara corrected. Because for the first time, the Ketheri weren't dictating the pace of the war. They were reacting to it. "Captain," Tactical said, "we're receiving external transmissions." "From who?" A pause. "Everyone." The channel opened, and for a moment, the bridge filled with overlapping voices from across human space. Reports, confirmations, laughter, shock, and something else. Energy. "They're pushing back. We just collapsed their forward line. They didn't see it coming. Send us the next sequence." Ilara listened, silent, because this was the real shift. Not just strategy, not just execution, momentum. "Channel it," she said. Her officer looked at her. "All of it. All of it." The chaotic flood of voices didn't get silenced. It got focused, sorted, integrated, not into rigid commands, but into something more flexible, alive. On the Valiant Edge, Rourke's console updated again. New targets, new timings. Not from command, from other ships. "They're feeding each other," his second officer said. Rourke nodded. "Because now we're all part of the same system. A system that didn't rely on hierarchy, didn't depend on perfect communication, didn't break when parts of it were lost, because every part understood the whole." On Terralise Prime, Vale Corps finally stepped back from the display. For the first time in his career, he didn't have an answer. "They have abandoned structured warfare," he said slowly. "They have replaced it with this." No one responded, because there was no word for it, no classification, no doctrine. And that meant one thing: "We cannot counter what we cannot define," Vale said. The silence that followed was heavier than any defeat. Because in Ketheri philosophy, if something could not be defined, it could not be controlled. And if it could not be controlled, it could not be defeated. Across the galaxy, human ships surged forward, not as a single fleet, not as scattered forces, but as something entirely new, connected, adaptive, unpredictable, and unstoppable. The retreat was long gone. The counterattack was everywhere. And the war had just changed forever. Fear didn't spread through the galaxy like fire. It spread like silence. At first, it was subtle. A delayed response from a Ketheri outpost. A patrol that failed to report back. Trade routes that went quiet, not from attack, but from absence. Then came the gaps. Entire sectors where the Dominion's presence simply thinned. Not destroyed. Not visibly defeated. Just gone. And that was worse. Because the Ketheri did not vanish. They advanced. They dominated. They consumed. But now, they hesitated. On distant observation stations, neutral civilizations that had watched the war from afar, new data streams began to replace old assumptions. Human fleets weren't holding the line anymore. They were moving through it. They're not pushing back, one analyst whispered on a civilian relay. They are rewriting the battlefield. Across the Orion expanse, an alien coalition that had once dismissed humanity as a temporary anomaly began pulling their observers from Ketheri-aligned systems. Not out of strategy, out of instinct, because something had shifted, and no one could explain it. On board the Resolute Dawn, Captain Alara Vance stood before a display no longer dominated by enemy formations. Now it was filled with absence. Sector 12, she asked. Cleared, Tactical replied. Enemy retreat confirmed. A pause. Yes, but not in formation. They're scattering. Ilara nodded slowly. They don't know how to fall back. Her first officer glanced at her. They've never had to. That was the truth of it. The Ketheri doctrine had perfected victory, but it had never prepared them for uncertainty. They're trying to regroup at central nodes, Tactical added. But we're reaching those points before they can stabilize. Because we're not chasing them, Ilara said. We're arriving before they do. That was the fear spreading across the stars. Not that humans were winning, but that they were already there. On the Valiant Edge, Commander Rourke reviewed incoming reports. System after system lighting up with the same result. Ketheri fleets disengaging, failing to reform, losing cohesion faster than they could rebuild it. They're avoiding engagement entirely now, his second officer said. Rourke leaned back slightly. Not avoiding, he corrected. They're hesitating. And that's different. Yes. He tapped the console, pulling up a projection of recent Ketheri movements. They still follow doctrine. They still calculate. They still predict. The officer frowned. Then why aren't they stopping us? Rourke's expression hardened slightly. Because every prediction they make is already wrong. That was the collapse. Not physical, cognitive. The Ketheri still had ships, still had firepower, still had numbers, but their certainty was gone. And without certainty, their doctrine meant nothing. On Terralise Prime, High Strategist Vale Core stood in a command chamber that had fallen into a state of controlled panic. Not chaos, never chaos, but something dangerously close. Report, he demanded. Outer sectors have withdrawn without engagement. Why? No viable predictive outcome, the officer replied. Vale's gaze sharpened. There is always a viable outcome. Not anymore. The words landed harder than any weapon. Another officer stepped forward. Internal simulations are failing to converge. Every model diverges within seconds of human contact. That is unacceptable, Vale snapped. It is happening. Silence followed. Because the impossible was no longer a theory. It was reality. They are not behaving as a unified force, the officer continued. There is no central command structure we can target. There must be, Vale said. There isn't. A beat. They are distributed. That word echoed through the chamber. Distributed. No head to strike. No core to disrupt. No pattern to exploit. Just a network. Alive. Adapting. Expanding. Vale turned back to the display, watching as another sector flickered and shifted from Ketheri control to something else. Not human occupation. Not yet. Just absence. They are not taking territory, he said slowly. They are taking initiative. No one responded, because that was worse. Territory could be reclaimed. Initiative, once lost, changed everything. On the Resolute Dawn, Ilara received a new transmission, priority tagged multi-source, coming from across dozens of systems at once. Captain, you need to see this. The display shifted. A compilation of intercepted Ketheri communications, fragmented, distorted, but unmistakably real. Unpredictable. No stable engagement. Do not pursue. Repeat, do not. Recalculating. We cannot. The signal cut abruptly. Ilara's first officer stared at the screen. They're warning each other. Ilara didn't answer immediately, because she was listening to the silence that followed. The absence of certainty. The absence of control. The absence of something the Ketheri had always possessed. Confidence. They're afraid, the officer said quietly. Ilara's gaze remained fixed on the display. Yes, she said, but not of us. A pause. Of what they don't understand. Across the galaxy, that fear spread. Through military channels. Through civilian networks. Through whispered reports and intercepted signals. The Ketheri, undefeated, unshaken, unstoppable, were issuing a command they had never needed before. Do not engage the humans. It didn't come from one leader. It didn't come from one system. It emerged everywhere, simultaneously, because it wasn't an order. It was a conclusion. On the Valiant Edge, Rourke read the same intercepted message. And for the first time since the war began, he felt the weight of what they had done. They've stopped fighting us, his second officer said. Rourke nodded slowly. Not yet, he said. Then what is this? He looked back at the expanding map, at the shifting lines, the collapsing sectors, the spreading pattern. This, he said quietly, is them trying to survive us. Outside, human ships continued their advance, not with chaos, not with destruction, but with purpose, with precision, with a kind of control that didn't rely on dominance, but on understanding. And across the stars, one truth became impossible to ignore. Humanity hadn't just turned a retreat into a counterattack. They had turned uncertainty into a weapon. And now, the entire galaxy was beginning to feel it. The war didn't end with a final battle. There was no single moment where the stars lit up and everything stopped. No grand clash where one side stood victorious over the other. Instead, it ended the same way it had turned. Quietly, system by system, decision by decision, across the galaxy. Ketheri fleets continued to withdraw, not in defeat, not in surrender, but in something far more unfamiliar. Acceptance. On the outer edges of former Dominion space, entire armadas powered down their forward drives and held position, waiting for orders that no longer came. Command chains fractured, not from destruction, but from irrelevance. Signals overlapped, contradicted, and eventually stopped, because there was nothing left to calculate. No model that worked, no prediction that held. And without prediction, the Ketheri doctrine had nothing to stand on. On board the Resolute Dawn, Captain Ilara Vance stood before a map that no longer showed a war. It showed space, open, shifting, unclaimed. Final withdrawal confirmed across primary sectors. Tactical reported. Remaining Ketheri forces are holding defensive positions and not advancing. Her first officer let out a slow breath. So that's it. Ilara didn't answer immediately. Her eyes traced the fading outlines of what had once been an unstoppable force. They're done trying to control it, she said quietly. And us, he asked. She turned slightly. We were never trying to control it. That was the difference. The Ketheri had fought to define the battlefield. Humanity had learned to move through it. On the Valiant Edge, Commander Rourke leaned against the command console, exhaustion finally settling into his posture. Around him, the bridge was quieter than it had been in weeks. No alarms, no urgent reports, just stillness. Sir, his second officer said almost cautiously, we're receiving formal transmissions. From who? A pause. Bam! Rourke straightened slightly. Put it through. The channel opened. Not with distortion, not with urgency, but with clarity. A Ketheri voice, steady but stripped of its usual certainty. This is High Strategist Vale, core of the Dominion. The bridge fell completely silent. "We are issuing a full cessation of forward operations," the voice continued. "All pursuit directives are hereby suspended." No one moved. No one spoke, because those words had never been spoken before. "We do not recognize this outcome within our doctrine," Vale said. A faint pause. "But we recognize it." Rourke's jaw tightened slightly. "Effective immediately. We will not engage human forces beyond defensive necessity." Another pause. Longer this time. "Further conflict will not yield a predictable resolution." The transmission held for a moment longer, then softer. "And we no longer understand the conditions of victory." The signal ended. No threat, no demand, no conditions, just truth. On the resolute dawn, Ilara received the same transmission. Her first officer looked at her, searching for something. Confirmation, perhaps. "Is that surrender?" he asked. Ilara shook her head slightly. "No, a beat. It's something else." Because surrender implied defeat. This was realization. "They're stepping out of the war," she said, "because they can't fight it anymore." Outside, human ships slowed, not halting, not withdrawing, but stabilizing. The forward momentum eased, not from resistance, but from choice. Because there was no need to chase an enemy that had already stopped advancing. Across human space, the pattern began to quiet. Signals that had once pulsed with urgency now carried confirmation instead of instruction. Convergence points dissolved. Engagement sequences closed. The network didn't collapse. It settled, like a system returning to rest after proving it could move. On distant worlds, colonies that had braced for extinction, stations that had prepared for evacuation, the silence of incoming warships never came. Instead, they received something else. Messages. Human messages. Short, clear, uncomplicated. "We're here." And that was enough. On Terralise Prime, Vale Corps stood alone before the final projection of the war. Not the beginning, not the turning point, the end. It showed the same thing every time. A retreat, a pursuit, a shift. And then, nothing he could define. "They did not defeat us," he said quietly to the empty chamber. "They removed the framework in which we could win." The words echoed, because that was the truth. The Ketheri had not been outgunned. They had been outgrown. Across the galaxy, other civilizations began to speak again, carefully at first, then with growing clarity. Not about the Ketheri, about humanity. They turned retreat into strategy. They turned uncertainty into structure. They turned war into something else. On the Valiant Edge, Rourke looked out across a starfield no longer filled with threat. His second officer stepped beside him. "So what do we call this?" she asked. Rourke considered the question, then shook his head. "We don't." A faint smile touched his expression. "Because the moment we define it, we limit it." She nodded slowly, understanding. Because that was the lesson. Not just how to fight, but how to think. On the resolute dawn, Ilara finally stepped back from the command display. For the first time since the retreat began, she allowed herself to breathe. "It's over," her first officer said quietly. Ilara looked out at the stars, at the space that had once been filled with certainty, now open with possibility. "No," she said softly, "it's changed." Because war for humanity had never been about following rules. It had always been about rewriting them. And now, the entire galaxy knew it. If you made it to the end of this story from HFY Global Tales, let us know in the comments what moment hit you the hardest. And share this with someone who loves powerful sci-fi like this. Because this wasn't just a story about winning a war. It was about changing what victory means. And humanity had just redefined it.